my talk is going to be have a couple components to it. The first being I'm going to talk a little bit about Northern California and the kelp forest up there, only because there is some really interesting kind of meeting points right here in the Channel Islands, more in particular Point Conception, but as a whole, want to talk a little bit about bull kelp and the differences between bull kelp and macrocystis, which we have out here, and then a tiny bit about the kelp restoration efforts in Northern California, and then some really cool archaeological evidence of Chumash kelp use that was literally just sent to me by John Erlinson, who's one of the famous archaeologists out in the Channel Islands. He literally just sent me, because he was part of the film that me and my friend Marco filmed over the last 5 years about Northern California kelp forest loss. And John Erlinson was interviewed in that film. I reached out to him a few weeks back saying, thanks for being part of the film, here's the film. And he sent me this some really cool stuff regarding the Channel Islands that I think you guys will be interested in. So, to get started, I grew up diving I started diving in about 2012 for abalone up in Northern California. If any of you guys know about what has happened up there, basically Oregon too, but basically the whole northern stretch of California here was lost. They say 90 because they want to be conservative, but it's probably closer to like 98% of the kelp, traditional historical kelp coverage from Crescent City to the Bay Area. So in 2012 was when I started diving. Literally everything looked like this underwater. I actually used to be pretty scared of it. But as you can see, a little bit different than what we have here. It's when you're like looking out, it almost feels like you're like looking through prison bars. But yeah, basically, when I used to drive up to Mendocino from San Francisco, you would basically see consistent kelp forest the entire way. Most of this stretch is rocky. There's some, obviously some beaches interspersed, but most of the stretch is rocky shoreline. And so pretty much this entire, whatever, 240 or 340 mile stretch here is one consistent kelp bed. When I kayaked it in 2019, this entire stretch had no kelp, pretty much. I could like tell you maybe like 5 places where I saw kelp in this whole stretch. That was when was kind of like, whoa, something's really going on up there. It's pretty bad. But I wanted to just go over kind of like what's happening up there as far as bull kelp, why it's a little bit different than down here. So obviously you got your bull kelp, your stipe, your nematocyst, and this is where you get your sori. This is where the spores and stuff will drift off bull kelp. But as you can see, unlike giant kelp, which has lots of different stipes and sporophyte is like what's the whole organism is called, the bull kelp just has one. And so if a sea urchin basically nibbles this just bottom stretch here, this bottom chunk here, the whole organism essentially dies and floats away. So it makes it really prone to urchin predation, which is what's happened up there. The most, so basically what has happened is, whereas down here in Southern California, as you well know, obviously we have the sheephead, we have lobsters that are inhabiting kind of a kelp forest keystone species in lieu of otters, right? So we lost otters the whole stretch from basically Point Conception down, though. We have this line, imaginary line, sheephead and lobsters. Obviously you'll see sheephead up to about Big Sur, but never north of that. And you'll see lobsters up to Diablo Canyon in San Luis Obispo, Avila Beach. That's about, you'll never really see lobsters north of that. So you basically have this imaginary line of keystone species here that inhabit a niche here that is not really matched in the central and northern California. Luckily, in central California, from Santa Cruz to Point Conception, because there are sea otters at Point Conception now, quite a few. This is all otter zone. So the otters are back. They're in enough numbers where they can kind of inhabit that keystone species niche that's required to not, like, there's still tons of urchin barrens in Monterey Bay. It's actually quite a problem, but at least the kelp beds that are currently existing there have some sort of defense mechanism. North of that, the only keystone species left that's, now that we have no otters and sheephead and lobsters don't make it that far north, the last kind of holdout was the Pycnopodia, the sunflower star. And I don't think anyone quite realized how big of an issue that was until they all died. So basically from 2017 until 2023, there was no sunflower stars seen from San Francisco Bay to the Oregon border. Not a single one. That's through all the scientific studies, all scientific diving surveys, anything. In 2023, an urchin diver found one in Mendocino. They found another one at the headlands up in Mendocino recently, and things were looking pretty grim because without, obviously, the last keystone species, we very quickly saw from 2013 to 2018, again, 98% kelp loss on the entire coastline. It would be pretty much like if the entire islands were to become an urchin barren in 7 years. Pretty shocking. There's definitely problems out there, but not quite kind of like what we have out here. And just recently, we have some really great news. There's been about 20 adult sunflower stars found on one reef in Sonoma County, and it's kind of like the first real breath of fresh air in a decade of kelp restoration, because up until this point we were just doing damage control. Like, we want to save this cove, you pay a shit ton of money to urchin divers to keep the cove somewhat clear of urchins, so that kelp can survive. And that's been having a positive effect in a few places, notably Noyo Harbor in Fort Bragg, Albion, Casper Cove. Those are pretty much the last holdouts. But recently, just in Sonoma, we just found 20 Pycnopodia. That area has a lot of kelp, and we recently got some underwater footage, and basically you can see the areas that have been cleared by the Pycnopodia, where you'll see urchin barren as far as the eye can see, and then you'll see a 20 by 20 area completely clear of urchins, and then at the other end is a Pycnopodia. So kind of cool. Just some, and then they're also doing a bunch of kelp restoration work in those 3 coves that I mentioned. Obviously, I'm sure you guys have heard of urchin culling. That's basically where you just smash urchins with a hammer. They're allowing that to go on at Casper Cove, and that was started in 2022. 2025 has been the best year for kelp since the disaster in 2013. So definitely a lot of progress, I think, especially knowing that Pycnopodia can live in a world where there still is sea star wasting disease, especially in the numbers that they found them at this one reef. So the goal moving forward now, kelp restoration, keep individual coves. So again, there's going to be kind of like coves dotted down the coast, and I sent the link for the bull kelp recovery plan. They kind of have the coves marked out of their main targets. So the goal is to keep those clear of urchins as much as possible through culling or commercial harvest, and then do kelp outplanting, and then eventually the goal, Sunflower Star Lab is doing a lot of work to raise, and they're successfully currently raising at least over 100. Do you know the exact number of?
I think it's like 74.
Yeah, so like a lot of, and they're kind of hitting that juvenile to mid-range size now, and eventually those might be outplanted onto the reefs up in Northern California. That's the hope, and that they'll start to take the place of a keystone species that has not been present there since 2013. So how does that relate to the islands? Obviously, kelp is really important. One thing that's been missing in the local kelp forest archaeological record, though, is kelp. Obviously, it doesn't really hold up well in a midden. And so J.P. Harrington and some of the other early anthropologists, they did a lot of salvage ethnography, talking to Chumash elders and such, and they came up with the assumption that the Chumash did not use kelp. And there's several journals and papers and different things that have essentially said that they did not use kelp or they did not eat kelp. And that was from a mainland study. There wasn't much research done on the islands. Also, as we know, the Chumash that were living out of the islands, when they came back and assimilated with the mainland, there wasn't quite as much identity, and so it was harder to track down. By the time J.P. Harrington and those guys were doing their stuff, it was hard to identify who was island Chumash, who wasn't. So there's always just been this question: were the island Chumash eating kelp? Were they using kelp? Were they using seagrass for baskets? All this kind of questions that we have yet to answer, because for the most part the archaeological record doesn't, that kind of stuff doesn't hold up. But like I said, here's another picture of kelp, old kelp. John Erlandson just sent me a paper published by was that?
Oregon State.
Yeah, well, he's in Oregon State, but anyways, there was a paper published from one of his excavations starting in 2013, I think ending in 2017, on Santa Cruz Island, TNC side. They don't tell us where, but there was a cave site there that they were interested in because there was a bunch of rum runner material there. So stuff that was deposited, 100 years or so ago. And so they were interested in that. All of a sudden there was a bunch of erosion and that stuff kind of started getting washed away. They were worried about the site as a whole. They started digging a little deeper and they came across several kelp-related finds. The most ridiculous is this woven, this is seagrass from the islands, and this is the artifact. So this is centimeters here, so 4 centimeters, probably like that size. But this is the bottom of a essentially seagrass bag that they accurately dated to somewhere around 1300 AD, which is kind of the height of the Chumash, I don't want to say the word empire, but the height of the Chumash occupation here in the channel. That was when most of the Tamil crossing, the trading, all that stuff was going on. So pretty fascinating. This is, I mean, you guys know seagrass. It's insane that this has held up for 750 years. And they're still able to find this in a cave on Santa Cruz Island in that condition, as if it's like a purse that was like left out on the islands, So definitely everyone is pretty shocked by the find. This was the other kelp, brown algae and kelp material that was associated with that woven seagrass bag. And then since then, because of the interest in kind of the use of kelp on the islands, they've also done a bunch of flotation samples and like genetic testing of a bunch of the samples taken from 5 village sites on Limu, and have found essentially even sites a little bit farther back from the ocean, pretty concrete evidence to say that the Chumash were eating brown algae and that they were using seagrass for their weaving instead of like we know that the Chumash on the mainland were using grasses for their amazing basketry, and there's their baskets here were known to even be able to hold water. They were so good. Out on the islands, they were probably using, based on our best evidence, seagrass, which is pretty fascinating. Here's just some of the numbers. So the feature dates back to right around AD 1250, but the basket itself is probably their best guess, somewhere around 1300. And then these are just some of the other proveniences in the excavation. But that all being said, kelp is important. I hope this map just helps people visualize. I mean, there really is, the point conception is kind of a collapsing point for a lot of stuff happening on the coast of California, and kind of interesting. It's also the bottom point for otters, and the Bay Area is kind of the top point for otters, so that the coastline can really be broken down into kind of 3 sections right now. So just if anyone ever asks and they're talking about kelp forest loss, different stuff. Down here, Brew Veins told me there's somewhere around 60 to 70% loss compared to historical coverage. So there's a problem here, but it's in the 60 to 70% range as opposed to 95% here. I don't know what the accurate numbers are for Central California, but as an anecdotal observation, we probably lost, I don't know, a good percentage. But just kind of good to know, a good way to talk to people about this stuff. Also, bull kelp only comes down to right about here. So that's another good thing to just keep in mind. San Luis Obispo is kind of the southern range of bull kelp, but macrocystis goes up further. It's just very rare in Northern California. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed.